How do you turn these investments into income?
I think those are the two main ways. First and foremost, typically, is shifting your allocation to more fixed income, more bonds to generate that income. And then the other thing with your overall assets, shifting those to income-producing assets. Stocks are a form of ownership, and ownership carries an element of risk, but it also carries with it a reward that goes hand in hand with it.
Why is tax awareness so important?
It's very critical that you understand how much do you have in pre-tax and how much do you have in Roth and how much do you have in after-tax. You can pull out 4% of your money out of that portfolio, increase it by 3% every year for inflation, and historically, you would never run out of money. Welcome back to another episode of Retire and Thrive, where we help you live your life with purpose, wealth, and confidence.
Yes, I'm Kamie. This is Dan. And today we have 4 questions that will soon be answered to help you build a retirement income plan. This is episode 12. We're so excited that you're joining us here today. And we focus on lessons throughout, and we're still on lesson 3.
Lesson 3 is you will thrive when your cash flows freely.
Yes. That sounds really nice, Dan.
Yeah, it's very, very nice.
It does, but it's hard to get there sometimes.
Yeah,
Last week, we talked about debt and how to chip away at some of that debt. So today we're focusing really on what in the world do we do once we don't have debt anymore? How do we go about our lives? Because it might be something that's foreign to a lot of people.
Focus on the cash flow, right?
Yes, the cash flow, which is nice to have. Let's get right into it. We have question number 1 is how do you turn these investments into income? Perhaps you have a lot of investments and you see that money, but what do I do with the money? It's sitting there. How do I get it? Where do I spend it? What's next? What do I do, Dan?
Great question. I think that's one of the bigger questions I get asked is, as you just alluded to, I mean, people save and save and save all of their life, and they feel like now that I've saved and I built up this pile, I mean, being a little facetious, of course, but generally speaking, in a retirement plan, some type of 401k, 403b. And I know I'd mentioned this on a previous episode, but oftentimes people don't know how that paycheck's going to get replaced. Mm-hmm. They've got the assets, but how do we turn it into income? Because an asset is not an income.
Right.
An income, as we talk about in this third lesson with cash flow, an income consistently comes in the door every single month, for example. Mm-hmm. And whether it's, most of it's done, of course, not through paycheck anymore, but it's just automatically deposited into your bank account, be it Social Security or pensions or whatever it might be. And so, yes, great question. How do we turn these assets that we've accumulated into an income source? And I would first start out by telling you, Kamie, that part of that is making a shift in your allocation. So think of it this way. When you're younger, you tend to have a little bit more aggressive portfolios, and those portfolios are really focused on growing, not producing an income. And not to get into the stock side of the business, but stocks either pay dividends or they don't pay dividends or some sort of combination. And so when we make these shifts in the portfolio, think of it this way, as a stock, and let's just, regardless of what the company is, I mean, we've got a lot of them here in Minnesota, we've got some in Rochester, but when companies make profits, they can choose to pay a dividend out, which investors can receive and they can spend it, or they take that profit and they reinvest it back into research and development or acquisitions of other companies. And so think of it more of a growth versus income. And so why do I share that with you? As a company, if I'm a publicly traded company and I have all these profits and I choose to pay out dividends, that's less money that we have as an employer, as a company to grow. And so generally speaking, these dividend-oriented companies tend not to grow as fast. So what does all this mean for retirement? Is when you're younger, you typically want to have more growth in your portfolio. And as you approach retirement and are retired, you want an income source. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple ways to do this. First of all, you can look at your portfolio and maybe start shifting some of the equities or the stock portion to more of dividend-paying companies. Some common dividend-paying industries or companies would be like banks, for example. They tend to pay a pretty healthy dividend. Or it could be a utility company or utility companies. They tend to be a little bit more of a income generating. And then if we go to the opposite extreme, more of your technology companies, they tend not to pay dividends because they're reinvesting in themselves. Mm-hmm. And so That's one way to shift some of your portfolio to income generating assets. The second way is to shift some of your allocation. So in a very simplistic way, we look at allocation as you've got stocks, bonds, and cash. And I know I touched on this before. You could create a third asset type, international, if you wanted to. But international, typically, we just lump into the stock side of it. And again, not all stocks pay dividends. Not all stocks are growth. But if you look at stocks as a whole as a growth asset, this may be the time that as you approach retirement or are retired to start shifting a little bit more towards the bond side. And what is a bond? A bond is like a CD, certificate of deposit. And it could be a government bond. It could be a municipal bond if appropriate. It could be a corporate bond. Think of bonds as a form of debt. So if you're a company and you issue a bond and I'm an investor and I buy that bond, it's going to pay me a fixed amount typically every 6 months. And then at maturity, whether it matures in a year or 3 or 5 years, then I just get my principal back. As somebody in their 30s, that's kind of boring and it's not going to give you real great rates of return. But that's one way to shift your overall allocation. So if I'm in my 40s, I might have 60, 70% of my money in the stock market, and I might have a little bit more conservative, maybe 30, 40% in fixed income or bonds. But then I get in my 50s and I start making even a little bit more of a gradual shift. And then now that I'm retired, I might end up having as much as, say, 60% in bonds that could potentially generate an income. And then I might keep 40% in stocks just as a hedge against inflation. Because let's face it, I mean, we all experienced inflation. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've gone to the grocery store in the last couple of years and, I don't know how they do this, but it's like you buy a bag of chips and not only is the price a lot more, but it seems like there's less
Fewer
in those
chips.
bags.
Yeah.
But that's true inflation.
Yeah. And I mean, we live in Rochester, Minnesota, utility rates going up again next year. Potentially 9% for your water, 7% for your power. So it's happening.
And property taxes. I mean, just all of it. It just it continues to go up.
And that's really everywhere, I'm sure. So, okay. Do you have another way? Yeah.
I think those are the two main ways. First and foremost, typically is shifting your allocation to more fixed income, more bonds to generate that income. And then the other thing with your overall assets, shifting those to income producing assets. And there's other types of income producing assets too. We don't work in annuities per se, but I know some people buy annuities that generate an income. It's a secure income. A lot of times those type of people want no fluctuation in value. They just want that income coming in every single pay period. We talked about on episode 11 last week that Social Security is a source of income and pensions are a source of income. Today is more about the portfolio. As your question asked is how do we shift that to more of an income?
For folks at home who this is a lot for them, what is your best advice for them to learn more and feel comfortable? Obviously, they can watch podcasts, they can read books, they can get a financial planner. What is the best route?
We talked about it last week, and I say the first thing to do is take inventory.
Oh, yes.
And inventory, this pertains specifically to the portfolio, not debt. We're done talking about debt because we're debt free, right? This is the world that we're trying to live in. Now we're in lesson 12. Take an inventory of what you've got. And I think it's important to know, how am I diversified inside of my assets? And again, we're just talking about portfolios right now. We're not talking about real estate. We're not talking about other assets. But inside of your portfolio, oftentimes, and again, I'm kind of assuming we're talking retirement plans, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a diversified portfolio outside of your employer plan. But regardless of where your assets are held, take a good look at what you've got in terms of your asset mix. How much do you have in stocks? How much do you have in bonds? How much do you have in cash? That would be the first step. And this is not any recommendation. I want to make it very, very clear here. As a very, very vague rule of thumb, you said, how do we make this simple? A very simple way to look at this is find out what you've got in stocks, bonds, and cash. Look at your age. And generally speaking, again, this is not a recommendation because everybody's different. Depends on what you've got in terms of dollars and other income sources and everything. But as a very vague general rule of thumb, take your age, and that should be part of your portfolio, should be matched to your age in conservative investments. If I'm 65 years old, you shouldn't have 80% of your money in the stock market. If you're 65 years old, as the very vague rule of thumb, maybe 65% of it's more safe and secure, like bonds or fixed income and cash. And so as you're younger in your 30s, it's okay to have 70, 80% of your money in the stock market, and it's going to fluctuate in value, and it's going to make you a little bit nervous, unless that's money that you're going to need in the short run. which I think we'll talk about. You'd mentioned before we started here,
Yeah.
you want to talk about the buckets. And so we will touch on that also. But to break this down for if somebody is retired, take an inventory of what you've got, look at your overall allocation, and then maybe make adjustments based on your age and your timeline.
Okay, good advice. And let's get right into it. What is the bucket strategy? That is question number 2, Dan.
Yeah, I never know where you're going to come at me with what questions. So I know we talked about the bucket strategy.
Yes,
I wasn't
the
sure,
bucket
but
strategy,
let's
yes.
talk about that. So the bucket
Yes.
strategy, I break it down into 3 different buckets. And the first bucket is all about liquidity. It's all about having money available when you need it. It varies from people to people, person to person, based on what your short-term needs are going to be. I mean, I own a house. I tend to drive a little bit older cars. With an older house and an older car, I probably need a little bit more on reserve than somebody that just moved into a brand new house and they maybe have a 2-year-old car, because I look at all of the things that could go wrong in my situation. And I could, at any given time, replace my furnace. I may need to replace my roof. My air conditioning unit may go out. I mean, all of these things, but if I'm a renter, I just know what my monthly rent is. I don't have to worry about all of that stuff. So that would play into it. At any time, my transmission might go out in my car. And so I'm asked, how much should you keep in bucket number 1? And I always say it depends on what you have for potential emergency expenses.
Right.
And that's just going to vary across the board. Kind of a vague rule, and you may have heard this before, but a lot of times people say at least 6 months worth of your income.
Okay.
I don't know if that's necessarily an accurate number, because I've got people that make $50,000 a year. So you're saying keep 25 grand. I got people that make 300,000. So you want to keep 150, and they don't have any debt and they've got new houses. So I think I tend to look at it as say, write down everything that you think could go wrong possibly. And it could be health. What's your deductible on your health insurance?
Yeah.
What would it cost to replace your car or to fix your car? Come up with that number and then build in a cushion. Maybe that number is $25,000. Maybe you set aside $35,000.
Sure. Okay.
By the way, that bucket number 1, that should be invested in something that's liquid, i.e. no penalty, and does not fluctuate in value.
Okay.
So it's pretty obviously where that goes.
Yeah.
That goes in money market accounts. That goes in savings accounts. It could be actually in short-term treasuries. But that's something that, A, you want to be able to get your hands on without penalty.
When you need it.
And it's not going to fluctuate.
Yeah. And bucket 2, 3 to 7 years.
Bucket 2 are things that you need, but you don't need them today. We had a client in the other day that was saying that they're definitely going to be selling their house, and they're looking at buying these new townhomes. It's interesting, because I've seen this for years and years and years, is a lot of times the family home that's 3,000 square foot home, then they go down and downsize to a new townhome. They actually come up with $50,000. And it's like, how is that? Well, it's because it's newer and so forth. But in this particular case, they were looking at these townhomes, and they're out 3 years. But they've got their name on a list of this development. And they know they're going to need to come up with $50,000 as of today. Maybe it's $60,000, $70,000 in 3 years. But based on what they think they're going to sell their home for and walk away with versus what they're going to have to come up with, let's just call it $50,000. That's bucket number 2. They definitely know they're going to need it. And it could be anything from, I need to get a new vehicle in 3 years, or I've got a child or a grandchild that has educational expenses. And again, in that bucket, you're not going to invest it in the stock market where it's going to fluctuate, because it's a known need that you have. And it's more about, I want to keep that principal safe, but I'd like to get a better return than maybe what a savings or a money market account is. And oftentimes what we recommend there is extend your maturities a little bit. Instead of keeping it instantly liquid and instantly available, maybe you invest it in a 24-month CD or a 24-month treasury note or a corporate bond or something like that.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it does. It does, definitely. And our final bucket?
That's really the long-term bucket.
Right.
And that can be anywhere between 7 or 10 years and beyond. And that's where we're okay with fluctuation. And I know we had mentioned it, just what you were alluding to earlier is that when you're younger, you can withstand some volatility. And so that's a bucket that maybe you're not going to need for 10 to 12 years. So if you're 45 years old and you're about ready to retire in 10 years, it's okay. or 15 years. It's okay if I've got a diversified portfolio and it goes from 500,000 down to 450 because you're not going to need it at that point. And I feel like, diversified portfolios, whether it's a combination of stocks and bonds and international and cash, those returns are never straight and symmetrical. They do fluctuate in value. And again, I know I've touched on this before. Stocks are a form of ownership, and ownership carries an element of risk, but it also carries with it a reward that goes hand in hand with it. So bucket number 3 is more of your longer term money. But I want to make one thing clear, and that is just because you're approaching retirement doesn't mean you need to move everything into bucket number 2 or bucket number 1. We touched on it in the last episode, but and just earlier is inflation's real. It happens. And that's part of the reason why you need to have some of that equity exposure, because we do want to keep up with the cost of living. And the only way to do that is to have some growth in your portfolio.
All right. Question number 3. What about the 4% rule? Does it still apply?
Yeah. So the 4% rule, I would say yes, it does. And the 4% rule is nothing more than saying if you take a portfolio, and this is based on a lot of academic studies have come up with this 4% rule. If you take a diversified portfolio and you put half of your money in bonds and half of your money in stocks, and I think most of the studies typically use indexes because mutual funds haven't been around that long or they want to keep it consistent. But if you just put it in the biggest indexes, the bond and the stock market, depending on the index they use, but generally speaking, you can pull out 4% of your money out of that portfolio, increase it by 3% every year for inflation, and historically, you would never have run out of money. So what does that look like? Again, I use the $1 million bucket because it's easy for me to do the math. But if I've got $1 million portfolio, 4% says I can pull out $40,000. And then next year, I should be able to pull out, what would that be? $41,200 because I'm increasing it by 3%. And you just continue to increase that every year by 3%.
Okay.
And what's also interesting about the studies that have been done is that 4% rule is, some people say, well, what if I went 70 stock and I only went 30 bonds? That actually fails. It doesn't go on for perpetuity. And part of the reason is because there are times historically, like in the 70s, and of course through the Great Depression, where the stock market had a prolonged downturn. So again, this is not advice to say put 50-50. It's just the 4% rule.
Sure.
Sometimes we refer to it, Kamie, as a sustainable withdrawal rate, which is how much money can I pull out without running out of money. And so that's what that 4% rule means.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for explaining that. Finally, our question number 4 that Dan is going to answer for us today is, why is tax awareness so important?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
That's a really big one.
And that's an intimidating one, because when we look at taxes, there's so much that we can know about the tax code and learn about it, and it changes.
The tax code changes. We just had the passage of the big, beautiful bill, which extended the tax cuts that happened in 2016. They claim it's permanent, but it's quite frankly permanent until it's changed. Right. So it is overwhelming. It is scary to people. But let me break this down very simplistic. Think of the tax awareness is you've got 3 different tax types. You've got pre-tax money that has never been taxed. Think of retirement plan at work. Then you have after-tax money that's already been taxed. We sometimes refer to those as non-qualified assets. Qualified assets are pre-tax. And then we've got non-retirement or non-qualified. And then we have Roths, which are tax-free. And let me break each of these down just real briefly. Mm-hmm. I feel like this is kind of a reoccurring theme because I feel like as I'm thinking about this, it's like take inventory of what you've got. So not only the allocation part of it, but back to this question, it's like it's important for you to know how much you have in each one of these categories or these tax types. But the pre-tax is a very easy way for people at work to set aside money and certainly put up to at least what the employer's matching. But if I'm making $75,000 a year and I put $5,000 into my retirement plan, instantly I only report $70,000 of income, not including deductions and anything else. So it's like, well, why wouldn't I save that money? Well, that's what the pre-tax does. But the challenge is with the pre-tax is if I put away $5,000 a year and I do that for 40 years and my nest egg, my retirement plan grows to $1 million, I paid no tax on that money. But I did get some tax benefit along the way. And we won't necessarily get in that today. But at some point, the government's going to force you to start pulling that money out Currently, it's age 73 because they want their taxes.
Mm-hmm.
It's called a required minimum distribution. So, but that's the pre-tax bucket. And there's nothing wrong with having money in pre-tax. The second bucket is after-tax money or non-qualified assets. And that's just, think of it this way. If you decided, Kamie, to invest $200 a month and you invested it into a mutual fund, and 20 years from now, that account was worth $150,000, you could pull that money out. You would only pay tax on the appreciation or the gain.
Sure.
The other thing is, as you go along, any dividends or capital gains that mutual fund kicks out, you pay as you go. Whereas in the pre-tax, you don't pay anything until you physically pull the money out. So that's the after-tax. There's no restrictions. There's no penalties for early withdrawal other than the market fluctuation, but it's completely liquid, but you will pay tax as you go.
Okay.
And then third one that I alluded to is the Roth. And the Roth is near and dear to my heart because it eliminates one of the biggest uncertainties, in my opinion, and that is what our future tax rate's going to be. And we've seen this over and over and over again where people have worked for the same employer for 30 or 40 years. They set aside 5%, 10%, and all of a sudden they retire and they've got this big amount of money that's in their retirement plan and they've never paid tax on it. And what they find is, if they take a pension from their employer, they take Social Security, and they're like, Dan, we've got $1 million, $2 million in my 403B, 401k, and I really don't even need that. And then all of a sudden they get to be 73 years old and they're forced to start pulling money out. It just compounds that tax problem. So rounding the whole, is tax awareness important? Absolutely. It's very critical that you understand how much do you have in pre-tax and how much do you have in Roth and how much do you have in after-tax.
All right. Some good advice there. Anything else that you wanted to touch on? Any client stories that come to mind that have to do with this? Success stories? I know you always have so many of those.
I'll share one with you. Sometimes I have to limit myself because I have a lot of, after as many years I've done this, I've seen a lot of stories, or I've got a lot of stories. But one in particular was a couple, and he worked in HR, and she worked at a local healthcare facility, and they made good income. They didn't make huge income, but they made good income. And he had actually taught prior to getting into his current employer, where he was in the HR department. And so he had a pension, and the pension was like $1,200 a month. He was in his 40s. And I had recommended, based on their current taxes, he had turned on that income and it wasn't going to stop. But they still had another 10 years, and they were putting in a lot of money in their 401ks. So we had projected out they were going to have like $1 million, $2 million, $3 million in their 401ks when they retired. But I said, the challenge is you need to have some money in Roth accounts that are tax-free. So we literally took that $1,200 a month. We set that aside in a Roth account for them. And I remember their accountant kind of questioned, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you have them maximized? And I said, because when they retire, they're going to need some tax-free money. And we fast forward 15 years later, when basically they were in their retirement in their 60s, they ended up buying a cabin. And I'll never forget this. He came to me about 5 years after buying the cabin, and he said, we were kicking out a couple $1,000s a month out of their portfolio from their 401k. Plus, he had the pension. She took the pension from her employer, and then they both had Social Security, and they needed, I think it was $40,000. They were buying a new boat for the cabin. And I said, the problem is if you pull out $40,000 from your IRA, that's going to push you from 12% to 22%. And we ended up doing the math. They could actually pull out an extra $10,000 from their IRAs, and we dipped into the Roth bucket, pulled out the other $30,000, zero tax. And just the whole point of the Roth, a lot of times I get asked, how much should I have in a Roth? And the answer is, it doesn't necessarily matter how much, but you want to have choices when you retire to kind of at least control some of the tax brackets that you're in.
All right. Well, a success story there for sure. Dan, thank you so much. Hopefully you at home, this helped you build a retirement income plan, or maybe refreshed you on a few different things that you might need to touch on as you head to retirement or continue to thrive in retirement. And again, lesson 3 is what we've been covering right now. I only have freedom when my cash flows freely.
You did it. That's a tongue twister.
But it is
I'm
a bit
impressed.
of a tongue twister. It is. Thanks so much for joining us this week. From Dan and myself, we appreciate you joining us, and you can always like and subscribe to our channel. We put out podcasts every week.